On the 1st of July 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa met British 8th Army in the First Battle of El Alamein. The next 6 months of combat at El Alamein proved to be the culmination of the North African campaign. But why were these battles taking place in the barren wastelands of the desert? In this video, we will discuss what made the North African campaign so important for both sides, and look at the political as well as strategic stakes for the Allies and the Axis. The genesis of the North Africa campaign lies largely with one man, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. When the war broke out in September of 1939, the region was divided between three imperial powers, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. Although Fascist Italy was formally allied with Nazi Germany as part of the Pact of Steel, Mussolini initially decided to keep his nation out of the war until his military was strong enough to fight a large-scale conflict. However, the shocking fall of France in June of 1940 convinced Mussolini to believe that Italy needed to join the war before it was over so he could fulfill his imperial ambitions. On the 10th of June, Italy officially joins the war as an ally of Germany. For Mussolini, Italy's objective in the war was to take advantage of what he believed to be the imminent collapse of the British Empire and occupy its possessions in Africa and the Middle East. Above all else, Mussolini dreamed of making the Mediterranean Sea an Axis lake that would be dominated by a new Roman Empire. The crown jewel of this restored empire would be the Suez Canal and Egypt, which served as the gateway to the vast oil fields of the Middle East. Against the advice of his generals, who argued that the Italian military was not ready to fight an industrial war, Mussolini ordered an invasion of Egypt to begin in August of 1940. For the United Kingdom, Italy's entrance into the war posed an existential threat to the British Empire. Following the fall of France, Britain and her Commonwealth allies stood alone against the Axis powers. The British had a strong presence in the Mediterranean and controlled both entrances into the sea, the Suez Canal and the Straits of Gibraltar. The Suez Canal was especially important as it bridged the gap between the western and eastern halves of the British Empire. Additionally, the island of Malta was a strategically vital British island which dominated the heart of the Mediterranean. Yet, Italy posed a real threat to these imperial holdings. Whereas Germany did not possess a sizable surface fleet, the Italian Regia Marina boasted the fourth largest navy in the world. Furthermore, the Italian navy vastly outnumbered the Allies in North Africa. Because the majority of the British Army was stationed in Britain to defend against a potential German invasion, the Commonwealth forces in Egypt were outnumbered nearly 5-1 by the Italian 10th Army. British Middle East Commander-in-Chief Archibald Wavell understood that Egypt could not fall to the Axis under any circumstances, or else Britain would be cut off from much of its empire. The loss of the Suez Canal would have been especially devastating, as its capture would open the door for the Axis to seize the Middle Eastern oil fields, which fed the British war machine. Therefore, maintaining control over the Mediterranean Sea and Egypt was a strategic and economic necessity for the United Kingdom. On the other hand, Nazi Germany had no imperial designs in North Africa. In contrast with Mussolini, Hitler sought to defeat the Western democracies before turning his attention to his ultimate war aim, the conquest of the Soviet Union. Once this was achieved, Hitler planned to let the Italians have most of the African continent as spoils of war. When Italy finally launched its invasion of Egypt on the 13th of September 1940, Hitler and the German General Staff had little to no interest in the Mediterranean theatre. However, the Italian attempts to seize Egypt ended disastrously. After halting the under-equipped and poorly led Italian army, General Wavell launched a counterattack with his outnumbered forces and routed the enemy. In one of the most one-sided campaigns in military history, the Allies destroyed the Italian 10th Army in Operation Compass and inflicted over 140,000 casualties while suffering less than 2,000 of their own. The Italian defeat was so decisive that Hitler felt he had no choice but to offer German military assistance in stopping the British before Libya was lost to the Allies. A desperate Mussolini accepted, and thus German involvement in the Desert War began. German High Command dispatched a relatively small motorised force to North Africa with the goal of holding the line, but the leader of this newly formed Afrika Korps had a different plan. Erwin Rommel was one of Hitler's favourite generals who had earned a reputation as a hard-driving, aggressive commander, unafraid to take risks. Despite the near-total destruction of the Italian forces in Libya following Operation Compass, Rommel stabilised the situation before launching a counterattack which pushed the Allies back into Egypt. This would mark the beginning of the Desert Fox legend, as the Allies struggled to defeat Rommel in open combat. Elated by Rommel's victories, Hitler began investing more into the theatre, and German forces in North Africa would eventually grow to over 150,000 men, 544 tanks, 8,173 vehicles, and 1,093 artillery pieces by the end of the campaign in 1943. As the Desert War dragged on, it began to take on outsized political importance for all of the major players. This was most evident in Italy, which bore the brunt of the fighting in North Africa. By 1942, the majority of Italy's armed forces were engaged in the campaign, including elite formations such as the Ariete and Trieste divisions. However, the biggest impact of the Desert War was seen on the home front. The Italian public had been lukewarm about joining the war, and soon began to actively turn against the fascist government as the army suffered heavy defeats in North Africa. Unlike Hitler, Mussolini was not the supreme leader of Italy, and still answered to King Victor Emmanuel III, along with the Grand Council of Fascism. While he still made the most important government decisions, Mussolini was keenly aware that he could be ousted from power if he was not careful. The leaders of the military were loyal to the king, and some were already beginning to plot behind the Duce's back. By the end of 1942, Mussolini himself had become pessimistic that Italy could win the war, but ultimately decided his best chance to remain in power was to see the conflict through to the bitter end, rather than endure a humiliating armistice with the Allies. In Germany, the Desert War was first considered a sideshow that would eventually turn into a major theatre of combat for the Third Reich. Mussolini's botched invasion of Greece in the winter of 1940 further increased Italian dependency on the superior German military. By the end of 1941, Rommel's victories, along with Italian weakness in battle, had convinced Hitler to devote more resources to North Africa and the Mediterranean. Rather than fully turning his attention to his planned invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler felt he needed to shore up his southern flank, and embarked upon a massive campaign to conquer the Balkans, Greece, and bafflingly, the island of Crete. There is little doubt that the Balkan campaign, Crete, and North Africa soaked up significant resources that would or should have gone to the Eastern Front. Rommel was transformed into a folk hero by the adoring German press, who lionised and often embellished his achievements. The legend of the Desert Fox would only grow as he continued to defeat much larger Commonwealth forces in open battle. However, Rommel was constantly frustrated that his forces were assigned less supplies than other fronts, as he believed North Africa was the key theatre of the war. His ultimate objective was the conquest of Egypt, followed by the capture of the Middle Eastern oil fields. Following his great victory at Gazala 2 weeks before El Alamein, Rommel convinced Hitler to endorse Plan Orient. Plan Orient called for Rommel's Afrika Korps and his Italian allies to seize the oil fields of Iraq and Iran, before turning north to link up with Axis forces advancing through the Caucasus Mountains. If successful, the ambitious operation would prove devastating to British and Soviet war efforts. For the United Kingdom, the North Africa campaign carried special political importance following the fall of France in the summer of 1940. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was acutely aware of the stakes involved in the Desert War, and paid close attention to the fighting. This was much to the annoyance of his generals, who despised Churchill's micromanagement of the war. Likewise, Churchill believed his generals were far too passive and longed for an aggressive desert commander like Rommel. Although Churchill's record as a military strategist is mixed, he understood that military victories in North Africa were critical to maintaining British morale and prestige, while also drawing Axis forces away from the Soviet Union. Churchill further argued to Stalin that securing North Africa and the Mediterranean would assist the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany, which was still ramping up in 1942. The RAF and its Commonwealth allies deployed over 2,000 aircraft in North Africa and the Mediterranean by the end of 1942. This number would swell to 3,462 by the end of the campaign, once American units began to arrive. As such, the Desert War would dominate the United Kingdom's political scene for nearly 3 years, and every victory or defeat carried massive ramifications. The best example of this came in June of 1942, when 8th Army was routed at Gazala, followed shortly after by the fall of the port of Tobruk. The shock of losing Tobruk, which carried powerful symbolism due to the heroic predominantly Australian defence of the city in 1941, was so immense that Parliament triggered a vote of no confidence in Churchill's government. During the debate, Member of Parliament Alfred Edwards famously declared, "If Rommel had been born in this country, he would by now have been a sergeant, not a field marshal." Although the motion was defeated and Churchill remained in power, the attempt underpinned the psychological and political importance of the North Africa campaign for the British home front. When the Panzer Army Africa collided with 8th Army at El Alamein in July of 1942, the importance of the clash was evident. Rommel was just 90 miles from the city of Alexandria, and beyond that, the Suez Canal. The Commonwealth forces in front of him had been savaged over the past 2 months, but 8th Army defiantly stood firm in the battle for North Africa.